In the spring of 1966, deep in a base area that no road reached, a Viet Cong commander named Chin was doing something his people had done safely for 20 years. He was resting. The place was chosen with care, the way all their sanctuaries were. It sat far from any road, deep in difficult country, behind rivers and ridgelines and miles of trackless jungle. To reach it on foot, an enemy would have to march for days, and he would be seen and reported long before he arrived, and he would arrive exhausted and expected. This was the oldest and best protection the guerrilla had ever possessed. Older than any weapon. Distance. The simple fact that some places were too far to reach. For a generation, that fact had been the foundation of everything. The French had never solved it. Chin had built his whole understanding of the war on it. There was the dangerous country near the roads, and there was the safe country far from them, and knowing the difference was how you survived. That morning, Chin heard a sound that did not belong in safe country. It started as a distant beating, far off, growing, and then it was everywhere, a hammering roar filling the sky, and he came out of cover and looked up and saw them. Helicopters. Not one or two. A whole formation of them, sweeping in low over the trees toward a clearing near his base, and as they flared and touched down, American soldiers were already jumping from the doors, a full company of them, armed and organized, landing in the middle of a sanctuary that was 3 days' march from the nearest road. Chinks could not know the name of any man in that formation, and it did not matter. What mattered was the thing collapsing inside his mind as he watched them land. The safe country was not safe. The distance that had protected his people for 20 years had just been crossed in 20 minutes by an enemy who did not need a road, who could step over every river and ridge and mile of jungle as though they were not there. A rifle could kill the man in front of you. This thing had just killed the map, and a guerrilla who has lost the map, who can no longer tell the safe country from the dangerous, has lost the one advantage that made him a guerrilla at all. That is what Chin dreaded about the helicopter, more than any rifle ever made. Now let me show you why. If a story like this matters to you, if the men who lived it on both sides deserve to be remembered, a like and a subscribe help it reach the people who care. It takes 1 second. These are the stories the history books leave out. Now, to understand why a machine that carried no weapons could be dreaded more than any gun, you first have to understand the weapon it took away. And that weapon was not a weapon at all. It was distance. To understand why the helicopter terrified the guerrilla in a way no rifle could, you have to understand the single most important weapon the guerrilla has ever possessed, which is not a weapon you can hold. It is distance. It is the ground itself and the time it takes to cross it. A guerrilla cannot win the kind of battle a regular army wants to fight. He knows this. He is weaker, more lightly armed, and fewer in number than the force hunting him. If he stands and fights a conventional battle, he loses every time because the enemy has more of everything. So the guerrilla does not stand and fight on the enemy's terms. He fights only when he chooses to briefly, and then he disappears, and the disappearing is the whole art of it. He melts into a population or into terrain or into distance, and he becomes, for a while, simply unfindable. And the deepest form of that disappearance, the one that mattered most, was the sanctuary. Every successful insurgency in history has depended on having places the enemy cannot easily reach, safe areas far from the enemy's centers of power, where the fighters can rest and reorganize and prepare in relative security. These are the guerrilla's lungs. He goes out to fight in the dangerous country, and then he comes back to the safe country to breathe. Take away his sanctuaries, and he suffocates. Leave them, and he can fight forever, because you can never destroy a force that always has somewhere safe to retreat to and rebuild. And what created those sanctuaries more than anything else was distance from roads, because for the entire history of warfare up to that point, an army moved on the ground, and an army that moves on the ground is chained to its supply lines. It needs a constant river of food, ammunition, fuel, and reinforcement flowing to it, and that river flows along roads and tracks and rivers. The army can only go where its supply line can follow, and it can only go so far from that line before it starves. Draw a certain distance out from every road the enemy controls, and beyond that line is country the enemy cannot sustain a force in. That is the safe country. That is where the sanctuaries are. The Viet Cong understood this with total clarity because their predecessors had beaten the French using exactly this logic. The French, for all their strength, were chained to the ground. They held the cities and the roads and the areas around them. And beyond that lay a vast countryside they could raid into but never truly control because they could not stay. The guerrilla owned the far country. He built his bases there, deep in the trackless regions, and he ran his war from them. And the French could rarely reach him because reaching him meant a long, exhausting, telegraphed march into his own ground on his own terms. Distance protected him. Distance was his fortress, and it was a fortress that no artillery could knock down because you cannot bombard a thing you cannot get to. The French had learned this the hard way over years and never found an answer. They would mount an operation into the far country, a column pushing out from the roads into the guerrillas' territory. And it never worked the way they wanted. The column moved at the speed of men and trucks. It could be heard and seen and reported from the moment it left the safe roads. Scouts ran ahead of it, and by the time it reached where the guerrillas had been, the guerrillas were somewhere else, warned days in advance by the simple fact that a large force cannot cross a lot of ground quickly or quietly. The French would occupy an empty camp, burn some huts, declare a success, and go back to their roads because they could not stay, and the moment they left, the guerrillas flowed back in. The far country could be visited. It could never be held, and it could never be surprised. Distance saw to both. That was the war Chin expected the Americans to fight because it was the only war anyone had ever been able to fight against a guerrilla in that country. Slow columns, telegraphed for days into ground, the guerrilla would have quietly left before they arrived. It was a war the guerrilla had already proven he could win. And then the Americans changed one variable, and the whole thing came apart. So when the Americans arrived, Chin and men like him expected the same war. There would be the dangerous country near the enemy's roads and bases, and there would be the safe country beyond, and the whole rhythm of survival would be knowing which was which, and keeping your sanctuaries in the far country where no army could reach them fast enough to matter. It had worked against the French. It had worked for 20 years. It was the bedrock. And the Americans were about to pour something onto that bedrock that dissolved it. The thing the Americans brought was not a better gun or a bigger bomb. It was a machine that did something no machine had ever done in the history of ground warfare. It cut the chain between an army and the ground. The helicopter changed one fundamental fact, and from that one change, everything else flowed. For all of history, to move soldiers, you move them across the surface of the earth, and the surface of the earth is full of obstacles. Rivers you have to bridge or ford, mountains you have to climb or go around, jungle you have to hack through, roads that may not exist. Every mile of ground between an army and its objective is a mile of friction, of time, of exhaustion, of exposure. And crucially, the ground is continuous. to get from here to there, you have to physically pass through every point in between, and the enemy knows it and can watch those points and can prepare them. The helicopter erased all of that. It did not go around the river or ford it. It flew over it as though it were not there. It did not climb the mountain. It went over the top. It did not hack through the jungle or search for a road, because it did not need a road or any ground at all until the moment it chose to land. A helicopter could lift 100 men off the ground in a secure area and set them down an hour later on any patch of open ground within reach, a hilltop, a paddy, a clearing, with no regard whatsoever for what lay between the 2 points. The rivers, the ridges, the trackless miles of jungle that had protected the guerrilla for a generation simply stopped mattering. They were still there. They just no longer did anything. The Americans built an entire way of war around this, and it deserves its name: airmobile warfare. They created whole divisions organized around the helicopter, most famously the 1st Cavalry Division, the Air Cav, built from the ground up to fight this way, and the aircraft at the heart of it was the UH-1 Huey, the machine whose thumping rotors became the sound of that entire war. The Huey carried the troops in, and it could bring their supplies and their ammunition and their water directly to wherever they were, and lift out their wounded so that a force inserted deep in the far country was not cut off at all. Its supply line did not run along a road. Its supply line ran through the sky, and the sky reached everywhere. Ride one of those insertions for a moment from inside the aircraft, because the speed of it is the whole point. A company of American infantry loads onto a line of Hueys at a secure base at first light. The aircraft lift off together, climb, and turn toward the mountains, and then they simply fly over everything. The river the guerrilla trusted to slow an enemy passes underneath in seconds. The ridgeline that would take a day to climb slides by beneath the skids. The miles of trackless jungle that had stopped every army for a generation are just green, scrolling past a few hundred feet below, meaningless. The men in the doors watch it go by. An hour ago, they were eating breakfast at a base near a road. Now they are descending into a clearing 3 days' march from anywhere, and the whole journey cost them a cup of coffee's worth of time. Then the aircraft flare and drop, and the men are out and moving before the skids have settled, and the helicopters are already lifting away to bring the next load. In the time it took the guerrilla to hear the rotors and come out of cover, the far country stopped being far. That was the trick. Not firepower. Speed that made distance meaningless. Think about what this did to the map. For 20 years, the map of that war had been divided into the safe country and the dangerous country, with the roads as the dividing lines. The helicopter erased those lines. Now, every point on the map was potentially within reach, not eventually, not after a long telegraphed march, but suddenly, in an hour, with a company of armed men appearing out of the sky. The sanctuary, 3 days' march from the nearest road, was now one short flight from an American airfield. The distance that had made it safe had been converted by a machine into no distance at all. And here is the thing to hold on to, because it is the whole point of the story. The helicopter did all of this while carrying no weapon. A troop-carrying Huey, in itself, could not hurt anyone. It was, in the most literal sense, less dangerous than a rifle. A rifle can at least shoot you, and the Huey could not. But it did something a rifle could never do. A rifle can kill the man in front of you. The helicopter took away the far country. It reached into the one place the guerrilla had always been safe and made it as dangerous as everywhere else. That is why the machine that could not fire a shot was dreaded more than the ones that could. The physical effect of the helicopter was enormous, but the deeper effect was psychological. And to understand why the Viet Cong dreaded it so much, you have to understand what it did to a fighter's sense of safety. Because safety was the thing his whole life was built around. A guerrilla lives with fear as a constant companion, but he manages it by dividing the world. There is the time and place of danger, the operation, the ambush, the raid when he goes out to fight and knows he might die. And there is the time and place of safety, the base, the sanctuary, the far country where he returns to rest and where he can, for a while, put the fear down. This division is not a luxury, it is a psychological necessity. No human being can endure unbroken fear indefinitely. The mind requires somewhere to stand down, somewhere the vigilance can be relaxed or it breaks. The sanctuary was not just where the guerrilla rebuilt his supplies, it was where he rebuilt himself. The helicopter took that away, not by attacking the sanctuaries constantly. It could not be everywhere, but by making it possible for them to be attacked at any moment without warning, anywhere, and that possibility, that mere possibility, was enough to poison the safety of every safe place. Because once you know that a company of Americans might drop out of the sky into your base area at any time, on any day, the base area is never truly safe again. You cannot fully relax in it. You cannot put the fear down. The place you went to breathe has become a place where you must always keep one ear cocked for the sound of rotors. You could see it in a camp in the way men reacted to a sound. Somewhere far off, a helicopter passes, maybe on its way somewhere else entirely, maybe nothing to do with them at all. And every man in that camp stops. Conversations halt mid-word. Heads tilt. Everyone listens, hard, trying to read the sound. Is it getting closer? Is it one aircraft or many? Is it passing or turning? For a few seconds, a whole camp of resting fighters is frozen, straining at a noise, because that noise might be nothing, or it might be the last warning they will get before 100 Americans are on the ground among them. And then the sound fades, and it was nothing, and they go back to what they were doing. But something has been spent. That little jolt of dread, that involuntary freeze happened again, as it happened a dozen times a day, every day, for years. A man cannot live like that and stay whole. The rifle, when it is not being fired at you, is just a rifle in someone's hands, and you can forget about it. The helicopter you could never forget about, because its sound was always somewhere in the sky, and any of those sounds might be the one that ended your safe place forever. Think about what that does to a person over months and years. The guerrilla could endure the dangerous country because he chose when to go there, and he knew that when he came back, he could rest. But the helicopter dissolved the line between the two. Now there was no fully safe country anywhere, ever. There was only country that had not been raided yet. The vigilance that a man could once switch off in the sanctuary now had to stay on, always, everywhere, because the threat could arrive anywhere, anytime, with about the same warning as a thunderclap. That is exhausting in a way that is hard to convey. It is the difference between a soldier who gets to go home on leave and one who can never leave the front, because the front is now everywhere, and there was a specific quality to the helicopter's threat that made it worse than ordinary danger. Its suddenness. Other dangers gave warning. An approaching ground force could be detected. Scouts would report it, the noise and dust of its movement would precede it, and the guerrilla would have time to melt away before it arrived. That was the normal rhythm, and the guerrilla was a master of it. But the helicopter gave almost no warning. The first sign was often the sound of the rotors themselves, and by then the aircraft were minutes away, and minutes later the Americans were on the ground. There was no time to organize, no time to prepare the ground, no time to do anything but react to soldiers who were already there. The helicopter did not just cross the distance, it crossed it silently from the guerrilla's point of view until it was almost on top of him. So the dread was not really about any single helicopter assault, most of which the Viet Cong survived, and many of which they fought off. The dread was about what the helicopter meant. It meant the end of safety as a place. It meant that the far country, the fortress of distance that had protected his people for a generation, was gone, not conquered, but rendered irrelevant by a machine that flew over it. And a man who has lost his sanctuary has lost something deeper than territory. He has lost the ability to rest. That is a heavier thing to take from a soldier than his life, and the helicopter took it from an entire army. There is a further consequence of what the helicopter did, and it reshaped the entire war in a way that made the guerrilla's life harder in every direction at once. The helicopter abolished the front line, and with it, the whole comforting geometry of where danger was and was not. In most wars, there is a front, a line, however rough, with friendly forces on one side and the enemy on the other. That line organizes everything. It tells you which direction the threat comes from. It gives you a rear, a place behind you that is safe, where you can put your headquarters and your hospitals and your supplies and your resting troops. The front line is frightening, but it is also, in a strange way, a comfort because it tells you where to be afraid and where not to be. Airmobile warfare erased the front line because the helicopter could put troops down anywhere. There was no behind the lines anymore because there were no lines. An American force could appear to the guerrillas north or south or directly on top of his position or squarely in what he had considered his deep rear. The threat no longer came from a direction. It came from every direction and from no direction because it came from above, and above is everywhere at once. For the guerrilla, this was disorienting in the most fundamental way. His entire method depended on knowing the geometry of the battlefield, where the enemy was, where he was not, which way was toward danger, and which way was toward safety. The escape route, the withdrawal, the melting away, all depended on there being a direction that was away. The helicopter took away. When Americans could land in any direction, in your rear as easily as your front, there was no reliable direction to retreat in, because the place you were retreating toward might already have a company of Americans in it, freshly landed. The guerrilla's most essential move, break contact and withdraw to safety, became a gamble because he could no longer be sure that safety existed in the direction he was running. This is why the airmobile tactics the Americans developed were so hard to counter. They could insert a blocking force behind a guerrilla unit and then drive that unit onto it. They could land forces on multiple sides of an area at once, sealing it. They could react to a contact by flying reinforcements directly to the fight from miles away, faster than the guerrilla could disengage and escape. The guerrilla's speed on foot, which had always been enough to escape a road-bound enemy, was suddenly not enough, because his enemy no longer moved at the speed of feet. His enemy moved at the speed of flight and could get ahead of him and around him and behind him, and there was no longer any such thing as a safe direction. Picture a unit trying to break contact the old way and watch it fail. The guerrillas are in a fight they did not want, and they do what has always worked: disengage and run for the safe direction, the one leading back toward their base, away from the enemy. They move fast, on foot, through terrain they know, and they come over a rise into a clearing, and there is a company of Americans already there, landed 20 minutes ago by helicopters that flew ahead of them while they were still fighting. The safe direction was not safe. It had a blocking force in it, put there by an enemy who could reach the far side of the escape route faster than the guerrillas could walk to it. That was the trap Airmobile made possible, and it was devastating precisely because it broke the guerrilla's most trusted move. His whole survival depended on there being an away, a direction that led to safety. The helicopter let the Americans put soldiers in the away before he got there. They could land a force behind him and drive him onto it. They could seal an area from several sides at once. They could drop reinforcements directly onto a fight from miles off, faster than he could slip out of it. The foot speed that had always been enough to escape a road-bound army was suddenly worthless against an army that did not travel on the ground at all. Put all of this together and you can see the full weight of what the guerrilla was facing. He had lost his sanctuary because the far country could be reached. He had lost his ability to rest because no place was reliably safe. And now he had lost the very geometry of the battlefield, the sense of where danger was and where it was not, because the enemy could come from anywhere and get ahead of him in any direction. The helicopter had not just added a capability to the American army, it had dismantled the entire framework within which the guerrilla understood and survived his war. No rifle could do that. No rifle could do anything remotely like that. A rifle operated inside the guerrilla's framework. The helicopter destroyed the framework itself. It would be easy to end this story here with the helicopter as the machine that broke the guerrilla, and it would be false. Because the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese did not lose that war, and any honest telling has to reckon with why the machine that took away their oldest weapon did not simply defeat them. The answer is as instructive as the dread itself. The first thing to understand is that the helicopter, for all its power, could not be everywhere. There were only so many aircraft and so many troops and so many hours in the day, and the country was vast, and the enemy was everywhere in it. The helicopter made it possible to reach any point, but it could not reach every point at once. So the guerrilla adapted by playing the odds. Yes, the Americans might drop out of the sky into any given sanctuary on any given day, but on most days they did not, because they could not be in 1,000 places at once. The guerrilla learned to live with a background level of risk everywhere, rather than safety somewhere, and to disperse and to hide better, and to keep moving so that even if the Americans came, they would find less than they hoped. You can see the adaptation in the way the base areas themselves changed. The old sanctuary had been a place, a real camp with substance to it, because it had been safe enough to build something. The new sanctuary could not be a place like that anymore, because any place could be raided. So the guerrilla spread everything out. Instead of one large camp, many tiny ones scattered, so that a helicopter assault that landed on one found only a fraction of the whole. He dug deeper and hid better, and built his important things underground, where troops landing in a clearing could not simply see them. He kept his units moving, so that the location an informer reported today was empty tomorrow. He accepted, in other words, that he could no longer be truly safe anywhere, and he reorganized his entire existence around surviving in a world without safe places. It worked, after a fashion. It kept the war going. But look at the cost of it. Every one of those adaptations was a downgrade, a way of doing with less, forced on him by the loss of the thing he could no longer have. He was not building strength. He was managing a wound. The helicopter had taken the fortress of distance, and everything he did afterward was an attempt to live without a fortress, dispersed, buried, always moving, never resting. He survived it. He did not stop dreading the machine that had made it necessary. And the guerrilla adapted his sanctuaries in a way that was brutally effective. He put them where the helicopter's reach ran into political limits. Across the borders, in neighboring countries, in areas the Americans were restricted from entering, the guerrilla rebuilt the safe country the helicopter had taken from him inside Vietnam. The helicopter could cross any river and any ridge, but it could not, for years, cross certain lines on a map that were drawn by politics rather than terrain. So the deepest sanctuaries moved to the far side of those lines, and the distance that no longer protected the guerrilla inside the country was replaced by a border that did. There was also the simple, hard fact of the landing itself. The helicopter could reach anywhere, but to deliver its troops, it had to come down, and coming down was the moment of vulnerability we have explored in other stories. The guerrilla could not stop the helicopter from reaching the far country, but he could make the act of landing there dangerous by preparing the likely landing zones and ambushing the assaults. He could not prevent the reach. He could raise its price. And he did, and the price in American aircraft and lives was very high. But notice what all of these adaptations have in common, because it is the real point. Every one of them is a response to a threat that had fundamentally changed the guerrilla's world. He was no longer fighting the war he had planned to fight, the war of safe country and dangerous country that had beaten the French. He was fighting a harder war on worse terms, in which his oldest and best weapon, distance, had been taken from him, and he had to scramble to replace it with lesser substitutes, dispersal, borders, and the bloody defense of landing zones. He survived. He adapted. He endured with a patience and a resilience that genuinely commands respect. But he survived the way a man survives after losing a limb, by learning to do without the thing he had relied on most. The helicopter did not defeat him, but it took away the fortress of distance permanently and forced him to fight the rest of the war without it. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, an enormous amount, and the dread the guerrilla felt for that machine was the entirely rational recognition of exactly how much it had cost him. Chin survived the war and grew old, and like many old soldiers, he spent his later years turning over the things that had defined his youth. And of all the American machines he had feared and fought, the one he came back to was not the deadliest. It was the one that had carried no weapon at all. He had feared the gunships, which could kill him. He had feared the bombers and the artillery, which could erase a position in seconds. But the fear he remembered most clearly, the one that had shaped his whole war, was the fear of the troop-carrying helicopter, the harmless one, the one that just brought men and set them down, because that was the one that had taken away the thing he could not do without. It had reached into the safe country and made it dangerous. It had ended, for him and for everyone he fought alongside, the ancient certainty that some places were simply too far away to be reached. He understood, looking back, that this was a deeper kind of defeat than any battle could inflict. A lost battle can be recovered from. A lost sanctuary is worse because the sanctuary is where recovery happens. The helicopter had not beaten his army in a fight. It had done something more corrosive. It had taken away the place where his army went to heal and forced it to live permanently in a state of exposure that wore men down year after year with no relief. He remembered the exhaustion of it, the way you could never fully rest, the way the sound of rotors, even far off, even harmless, would tighten every man in a camp, because it might be nothing, or it might be a company of Americans landing in your one safe place. He remembered, too, the particular grief of the men who had fought the French. There was a generation of them, the older fighters who had won the earlier war precisely by using the far country the way it had always been used. They had beaten a Western army by retreating into distances it could not cross, and they carried that victory in them as a kind of certainty about how this kind of war worked. And they watched a machine take that certainty apart in an afternoon. The younger fighters had never known the old safety, so they did not fully grasp what had been lost. To them, a war without safe places was simply the war, the only one they had ever known. But the veterans knew. They had lived inside the fortress of distance, and they had felt it dissolve, and something in them never accepted it. They spent the rest of the war grieving a shield their fathers had trusted and their sons would never know. And he came to a strange respect for the machine, and for the men who flew it, precisely because it was not a weapon. Anyone can build a bigger gun. The Americans had done something cleverer and more profound. They had looked at the guerrilla's greatest strength, his use of distance and sanctuary, and instead of trying to overpower it, they had simply made it obsolete with a machine that rendered distance meaningless. It was, Chin thought, the single most important thing the Americans brought to that war, and it was the thing that had made his life hardest, and it had never fired a shot at him. He said once that the young men on his side had feared many American things, but that the veterans, the ones who had fought the French and knew what the old war had been like, feared the helicopter most of all, because only they fully understood what had been lost. The young fighters had never known the old certainty of the far country, so they did not grieve it. But the old ones remembered a time when distance meant safety, and they had watched a machine take that away in an afternoon, and they never got over it. The helicopter had not just changed the tactics of the war. For the men who remembered the war before it, it had ended a way of surviving that was older than any of them, and left them fighting for the rest of their lives without the shield their fathers had trusted. Here is what the Viet Cong finally understood about the helicopter and why they dreaded a machine that carried no weapon more than any rifle ever made. A rifle is a terrible thing, but it operates within the rules. It can kill the man in front of you, and that is a real and mortal danger, but it does not change the nature of the war. You can be brave in the face of a rifle. You can take cover from it, flank it, outnumber it, or simply avoid the place where it is. A rifle is a threat you can reason about because it obeys the ancient geometry of the battlefield. It reaches only as far as it reaches from where it is, and everywhere beyond that is safe. The whole art of the guerrilla was built on that geometry, on knowing where the danger was and where the safety was, and staying in the safety until he chose to visit the danger. The helicopter broke the geometry. That is the whole of it. It did not threaten the guerrilla within his framework. It dismantled the framework. It took the most fundamental fact of ground warfare, that distance is protection, that far away means safe, and it simply deleted that fact, replacing it with a world in which no distance protected anyone, and safety was no longer a place you could go, and the enemy could appear anywhere, from any direction, at any moment, with almost no warning. A rifle takes your life if it is unlucky for you. The helicopter took the map, and the sanctuary, and the rest, and the ability to ever fully stand down. It took the things that made survival possible in the first place. And it did all of this, and here is the part that captures the whole strange truth of it without being able to hurt anyone at all. The troop-carrying helicopter was one of the least dangerous machines in that war, in the narrow sense that it could not fire a shot. A child could see that a gunship was more lethal, a bomber more destructive, a rifle more immediately deadly, but the guerrilla, who understood his own war better than anyone, dreaded the harmless machine most because he understood that lethality was not the point. The point was reach. The point was that this machine had taken away the far country, and a guerrilla without a far country is a guerrilla who can never rest, never heal, never be truly safe for as long as the war lasts. There is a lesson in that which reaches far past Vietnam, and it is worth naming. We tend to measure weapons by what they can destroy, the size of the blast, the range of the gun, the weight of the bomb. But the most decisive military technologies are often the ones that change what is possible rather than what can be destroyed. The helicopter destroyed nothing. It carried men from one place to another, and in doing only that, it rewrote the fundamental terms of an entire kind of warfare and took away from the guerrilla the one advantage that 10 years of French firepower had never touched. The bomb threatens what exists. The helicopter changed what could happen. And of the two, it was the second that the guerrilla found he could not answer. They chose their sanctuary the way their people had for 20 years, far from any road, behind rivers and ridges and days of trackless jungle, protected by the oldest weapon there is. And a machine that could not fire a shot crossed all of it in 20 minutes and set 100 armed men down in the middle of the one place they thought no one could reach. It did not kill Chin that day. It did something he found harder to bear. It told him and his whole army that there was no safe place left in the world, and there never would be again as long as those rotors were in the sky. That is why they dreaded the helicopter more than any rifle. A rifle could only take a life. The helicopter took away a way. Now you know why. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to the end. These are the histories worth keeping, not just the famous battles with their famous names, but the machines and the ideas that quietly changed everything on both sides of the wire. If it meant something to you, a like genuinely helps. It tells the algorithm that this kind of history matters, and it helps these videos find the people who care about them. If you're not subscribed yet, now is a good time. Hit subscribe and the bell so you never miss a new one. I would love to know where you are watching from today, and if someone in your family served in Vietnam, a pilot, a crew chief, an air cav trooper, a grunt who rode those helicopters into the far country, anyone in any unit, tell me about them in the comments. Every one of those men carried a story like the one you just heard. Most of them never told it. This is how we make sure they are not forgotten.